With a loud whoosh, a torrent of seawater surged into the pitch-black space, choking me instantly. I coughed violently, my arms frantically slapping the rising water until I managed to force myself upright. Submerged up to my waist in the complete darkness, I gasped for air, utterly bewildered and wondering if my house had somehow flooded. Before I could process what was happening, the water receded as quickly as it had arrived, leaving me standing on a strange, damp ground that felt strangely soft and rubbery beneath my feet. I knew I was no longer in my city apartment, as the surrounding space was so dark I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Suddenly, a system notification echoed directly in my mind, welcoming me to a survival world inside a giant fish and announcing that I would coexist with it. A supply box clattered to the ground near my feet, which I found by crouching and blindly feeling around. Opening it rewarded me with 3 loaves of bread, 3 bottles of mineral water, and a hand-cranked headlight. I immediately switched on the light, casting a dim yellow beam that illuminated a small area 2 to 3 meters ahead. Shifting the beam revealed blood-red, fleshy walls all around me. I was inside the creature's stomach, but I quickly calmed down, realizing our symbiotic relationship meant I was safe here. The system wished me luck and went quiet. I took the opportunity to explore my 5 by 5 by 3 meter surroundings, noticing a foul-smelling pool of yellow liquid about 3 meters wide at the back, which I assumed was where food was digested. Soon after, a semi-transparent blue interface appeared before me with 4 tabs: communication, trading, biological encyclopedia, and physical attributes. The encyclopedia listed only one organism, a newborn Leviathan measuring 30 meters and weighing 180 tons that fed on algae. I was amazed to realize this massive baby was my host creature. Checking my own physical attributes, my intelligence was 10, strength was 7, physique was 9, and speed was 11. As a grueling coder who ran daily to stay healthy, these numbers made total sense. The headlight suddenly died, plunging me back into darkness, but I sat on my supply box and calmly hand-cranked it to recharge while browsing the world chat. Messages were flying by as confused people panicked or joked about their situations, though I paused the stream to read through them carefully. I agreed with the consensus that it was best not to act rashly. Suddenly, the entire room shook violently, knocking me backward onto the soft ground. The tremors lasted over 10 seconds before settling into a faint vibration, signaling that the Leviathan was moving. Hearing a roar of rushing water from the esophagus, I pressed myself against the fleshy wall while hugging my supply box. Seawater flooded the stomach up to my waist again before draining out through the digestive tract. Using my light, I spotted a new wooden box left behind, which yielded another loaf of bread and a bottle of mineral water. Realizing this was how I would gather supplies, I braced myself for the next rush of water by squatting low. When the water receded this time, it left behind a massive pile of algae instead of supplies. More seawater and algae continued to stream in over the next stretch of time until algae filled 2/3 of the stomach space. Finally, the vibration stopped, and the stomach fell completely silent. Out of nowhere, a childish voice echoed directly in my mind, complaining about being full and needing to digest. My heart skipped a beat. Using the dim light of my headlight, I frantically scanned the remaining empty space, but I was entirely alone, terrified by the sudden presence of a voice in the dark. I was suspicious for a moment, but I quickly realized that this was a survival world, so ghost stories made no sense. Recalling the sound, I deduced that it had to be the Leviathan speaking. To confirm this, I checked the world chat channel, but everyone was only arguing about whether seaweed was edible. No one mentioned hearing a child's voice. Even though no one else noticed it, I was certain I was not hallucinating. I realized that only I could hear it, which meant I was special. A surge of excitement washed over me as I wondered if this was my personal cheat code. For a fleeting moment, I felt like the absolute king of this world. However, I soon calmed down and realized the ability seemed useless. I tried communicating with the Leviathan, but it did not respond at all. I could only hear its thoughts, not command it. As I pondered how to use this, my stomach floor began to undulate rhythmically, slowly pushing the accumulated seaweed toward the digestion pool. The process was agonizingly slow, and even after cranking my headlight again, the pile had barely moved. At this rate, full digestion would take 7 or 8 hours. The Leviathan had stopped moving because it was digesting, so I wondered what would happen if I sped up the process. I immediately grabbed armfuls of seaweed and rushed to throw them into the digestion pool. It took me a full hour of relentless labor to dump all the seaweed into the liquid. Once finished, I began gasping for air and felt severely lightheaded. I suddenly realized that the stomach did not generate oxygen, and my intense physical labor had rapidly depleted the limited supply. Terrified of suffocating, I cursed my own foolishness and collapsed to the ground to conserve my breath. As the air thinned further, my head spun, and I genuinely thought I was about to die. Just as I reached my limit, the stomach shook violently, and a fresh wave of seawater surged in, bringing desperately needed air. I burst out of the surface, gulping down fresh oxygen until I finally recovered my strength. The water receded, leaving me shaken but alive. My headlight went out again, so I cranked it back to life, revealing a brand new supply box nearby. I retrieved my previous 2 boxes, which had been washed a short distance away, giving me 3 in total. I opened the new one and received 10 pieces of wood, 10 pieces of stone, and 10 pieces of dirt. Though disappointed by the lack of food, I checked the world chat and realized something crucial. Other survivors only had 1 supply box because their Leviathans were digesting at a snail's pace, and they had no idea. Thanks to my unique ability, I was developing 3 times faster than everyone else. I resolved to keep this secret to ensure my own survival advantage. Soon after, another rush of seawater entered, and when it cleared, I spotted a 4th supply box. Opening it granted me the blueprint for an algae oxygenation tank. This was the exact solution to my oxygen problem. The blueprint merged into my system interface, requiring 10 stones, seawater, and algae to craft. I already had the stones, and the next feeding cycle would provide the rest. Just then, the childish voice echoed in my mind again, announcing that it was tired and going to sleep. The stomach wall stopped vibrating, confirming that the Leviathan had officially entered its resting phase. The child's voice echoed in my head, announcing its hunger, and I instantly snapped awake. Since I was inside the stomach cavity with no way to tell day from night, I aligned my schedule with the creature. When it slept, I slept. The fleshy walls vibrated violently as the massive organism began to move. Having eaten only 1 piece of bread the previous day to conserve supplies, my stomach growled with hunger. I reluctantly ate another slice and drank half a bottle of water, leaving me with just 2 pieces of bread and 3 bottles of mineral water. The scarcity made me deeply uneasy, and I silently prayed for food in the next supply crate. Soon, the sound of churning seawater echoed down the esophagus, and a massive wave flooded the space. Having endured this several times, I braced my body against the supply box to keep it from washing away. The beam of my headlight revealed that the water had brought a fresh batch of seaweed. I immediately opened my system interface and clicked to build the algae oxygenation tank. In a flash of blue light, the 10 stones from my supply box flew out and assembled into a stone trough 1 meter high and half a meter wide. Seawater and seaweed automatically filled the trough, with the plants taking root in the pebbles at the bottom. Tiny bubbles quickly formed on the leaves, confirming it was producing oxygen despite the total lack of sunlight. I leaned over and inhaled deeply, relieved to have a steady air source. When the seawater receded, it left behind a huge pile of seaweed. Learning from my past mistake, I did not wait for the feeding cycle to end. I immediately began throwing the algae into the digestion pool while the oxygen levels were still high from the incoming tide. Running back and forth was exhausting, but I paid close attention to the sounds from the esophagus. Whenever I heard rushing water, I quickly backed away from the pool to avoid being swept in by the surge. The Leviathan fed 5 times in total, bringing fresh water and air with each cycle. By the time the feeding phase ended, I had already cleared 4/5 of the seaweed. Exhausted but safe from suffocation, I rested against the oxygenation tank before returning to finish the job. As I reached into the remaining pile of seaweed, something sharp sliced my forearm. I gasped and pulled my hand back, watching blood drip down from a 2-inch wound. Frightened, I scrambled backward as the pile shook and a strange creature sprang out. I quickly cranked my headlight to ensure the beam remained bright, terrified of being ambushed in the pitch black. A clicking sound of a heavy shell slapping against the floor echoed nearby, but the creature seemed to be bouncing in place without approaching me. Knowing I needed to bandage my bleeding arm safely, I held my breath and cautiously stepped forward with my light. The beam finally illuminated the creature, revealing that it looked remarkably like a giant shrimp. The shrimp was remarkably large, roughly the size of an adult forearm, fully red with a sharp dagger-like spine protruding from its head. The deep wound on my arm had been caused by that very spike. Seeing that it was just a giant prawn rather than a lethal monster, my panic subsided into pure rage. I was simply moving algae when it slashed me, leaving a 5-centimeter gash with no medical supplies in sight, leaving me at serious risk of dying from an infection. Furious, I picked up a supply box and hurled it at the creature, but the soft ground and its hard shell absorbed the impact. After hitting it multiple times to no avail, I kicked it away to keep its spikes at bay. I stopped wasting time, tore a strip of cloth from my underwear, and bound my forearm tightly to slow the bleeding. To avoid further injury, I resumed moving the algae, making sure to kick each pile with my shoe first to flush out any hidden creatures. Within 15 minutes, I successfully moved all the remaining seaweed without encountering any other shrimp. With the main task complete, I turned my attention back to my attacker. I wanted its hard tail shell to serve as a forearm guard, and its sharp head spike as a makeshift knife. I trapped the shrimp under an empty supply box, tied a long cloth strip around its body, and began spinning it in high-speed circles. Using the centrifugal force, I hurled the creature violently against the stone wall of the oxygenation tank. The impact shattered its hard outer shell, but it remained alive. I swung it 2 more times until it finally stopped moving. Using my foot to snap off the sharp 7-centimeter head spike, I used the point to meticulously slice open its softer belly. It took me half an hour of arduous cutting to completely peel the tail shell. Though cracked and ragged, the shell fit around my forearm well enough to serve as crude armor, leaving me with a pile of fresh, crystal-clear, raw shrimp meat. I desperately wanted to eat it, but I lacked fire, and attempting to spark a flame in an enclosed space with limited oxygen would be suicidal. As the Leviathan began moving again to indicate the end of its digestion phase, I quickly stashed the shrimp meat inside a supply box to prevent it from washing away. Blood was already soaking through my makeshift bandage, forcing me to open the trading channel to look for real medical supplies. Most people were trading basic materials for bread, but I eventually spotted a listing offering a single medical bandage for 3 loaves of bread. Since I only possessed 2 loaves of bread and 3 bottles of water, I privately messaged the seller to negotiate, pretending I was merely stocking up for future safety. The seller saw right through my bluff, accurately guessing that I was already injured and desperate. Realizing I could not hide the truth, I sent a firm message offering my last 2 pieces of bread and a bottle of mineral water, making it clear that it was literally every piece of food I owned. The seller messaged back, claiming they were not trying to drive up the price, and offered to trade the bandage for just 1 loaf of bread and 1 bottle of mineral water. I was overjoyed, though a bit shocked to find a decent person willing to compromise in such a harsh, resource-scarce world. Checking the updated listing, I immediately confirmed the trade. A blue light flashed over my supply box, replacing my food with a roll of medical hemostatic bandage. Painfully washing the long scratch with half a bottle of fresh water, I wrapped the wound tightly until the bleeding finally stopped. The seller messaged again, asking out of curiosity how I managed to get hurt inside the safe stomach cavity. Realizing they were seeking valuable tactical information, I appreciated their fair trade and explained that a giant forearm-sized shrimp with sharp head spikes was hiding inside the seaweed piles. I warned them to be careful, omitted my strategy of moving the algae manually, and agreed to stay in touch for mutual aid. Afterwards, I moved my algae oxygenation tank and all 4 empty supply boxes directly next to the esophageal diaphragm, stacking them safely above the high water line so future ocean surges would no longer sweep my possessions away. When the Leviathan swallowed the next supply box, I opened it only to find 10 stones, 10 dirt, and 10 hay. Disappointed by the lack of food, I waited anxiously until the following box arrived, which contained a blueprint for a small planting box. I was thrilled at the prospect of growing my own crops, but when I attempted to build it using the required 10 wood and 10 soil, nothing happened. Even after manually arranging the raw materials on the floor, the system refused to assemble the structure, shattering my immediate dreams of self-sufficiency. Down to my last loaf of bread, I browsed the trade channel and saw someone offering watermelon seeds for bread, but I could not afford to trade away my only meal. Hours later, the final supply box of the day washed in. I placed my hands on the lid and prayed for sustenance, receiving 1 apple and 1 banana. While fresh fruit was a luxury, it lacked the dense calories I needed for heavy manual labor. Realizing others might crave fresh produce, I listed both fruits on the market for 2 loaves of bread, and the trade completed almost instantly. With 3 total loaves of bread and a bottle and a half of water, my short-term survival was secured until the day after tomorrow. Right on cue, the child's voice echoed in my head, grumbling that it was exhausted and going to sleep. Still soaked from the incoming waves and needing to keep my bandaged arm completely dry, I lined up 7 empty supply boxes side by side along the damp floor. Stripping off my wet clothes, I stretched out across the dry wooden crates, sighing with immense relief as I finally drifted off to sleep. The stomach wall began to vibrate violently as the Leviathan resumed its movement, waking me from a dream filled with delicious food. Sitting up on my makeshift bed of supply boxes, I licked my lips and wondered if a future box might contain a way to heat food, as I still could not bring myself to eat the raw shrimp meat from yesterday. I ate my last piece of bread and drank the remaining water, which barely staved off my hunger. Checking my arm, I was relieved to find that the wound showed no signs of infection. After rebandaging it, I stacked all 7 supply boxes onto the algae oxygenation tank and waited for the creature to feed. While waiting, I browsed the world chat and saw a survivor desperately begging to trade a single watermelon seed for any piece of food before he fainted from exhaustion. Recognizing him as the trader from yesterday, I privately messaged him and offered to trade my raw shrimp meat for his seed. Though I warned him that the unknown meat might be poisonous, he was desperate enough to take the gamble and completed the trade. While others would view trading dense meat for a single seed as a terrible loss, I already possessed the small planting box blueprint. To me, seeds were the essential puzzle piece for long-term survival, whereas raw meat was useless and perishable. When the Leviathan began feeding, I resumed my routine of manually hauling seaweed into the digestion pool. Having been ambushed yesterday, I wrapped my arms in the crude shrimp head and tail shells to act as gauntlets. Using my armored hands to probe the algae piles before grabbing them paid off immediately, as I encountered 3 more giant shrimp. 2 of them struck out at me, but their sharp spines harmlessly bounced off my shell armor. Once all the seaweed was cleared, I used a sharp head spike to slice the thin membrane connecting the head and tail of each shrimp, cleanly prying the shells off intact without ruining them like I had yesterday. Stashing the fresh meat and intact shells into a supply box, I waited for the next tide. The first supply box delivered by the sea contained a can of yellow peaches, providing much-needed sugar and liquid. Shortly after, the trader messaged me to ask if I had any more of the spiky krill meat. Surprised that he knew the creature's actual name, I learned that a second entry had unlocked in the biological encyclopedia. Opening the interface, I confirmed that spiky krill flesh was edible and provided a permanent strength boost, while their shells made effective armor. Realizing these krill lived deeper in the ocean, I deduced that my active digestion help had driven my host Leviathan far ahead of others into richer, more dangerous waters. My thoughts were interrupted when the trader messaged again, offering a brand new blueprint he just pulled from a supply crate in exchange for more krill meat. Seeing Zhang Haitao's message left me completely stunned, as the spiky krill meat I had resisted eating actually granted permanent strength boosts. Turning my attention to the supply box containing the remaining krill meat, I immediately abandoned all plans of trading it away. Eating the meat from these 3 krill would grant 3 points of strength, bringing my physical power back to that of a normal person. Though I briefly wondered if hunting more krill could grant infinite power, I quickly dismissed the absurd thought, knowing the system would limit such boosts to keep the world balanced. To verify my suspicion, I messaged Zhang Haitao to ask about his new blueprint. He revealed it was a blueprint for a spiked helmet crafted from krill shells. Recognizing a perfect match for my growing collection of monster parts, I eagerly agreed to trade a piece of krill meat for it. After exchanging names, I learned the crafting recipe required 3 intact krill shells and 5 pieces of cloth. I had the shells but lacked the fabric. Setting the blueprint aside, I decided to finally try the krill meat myself. Picking up a large chunk, I took a massive bite, surprised to find it tender, sweet, and completely free of any fishy odor. Consuming the whole portion left me feeling delightfully full for the first time in 3 days, and a system notification promptly confirmed that my strength attribute had risen to 8. 2 hours later, the second supply box arrived with seawater, granting 10 stones, 10 pieces of wood, and 10 pieces of cloth. With the necessary materials in hand, I immediately crafted the spiked helmet. A blue light flashed, consuming the shells and fabric to produce a comfortable, padded helmet adorned with 3 sharp spikes on top. I placed it securely on top of my elevated supply stack before reading a new message from Zhang Haitao. He reported that eating his second piece of krill meat granted no additional strength, proving the attribute boost was a one-time bonus. Realizing he had traded a rare blueprint for regular food, he sheepishly asked if I could spare another piece of meat to balance the deal. Understanding his predicament, I promised to give him another krill if I caught one tomorrow, though I secretly planned to test a second piece myself first to verify his claim. As the final tide of the day receded, it left behind a supply box containing a single self-heating pack. My mind raced with the possibility of finally cooking hot meals using empty peach cans, but my survival hoarding instincts quickly kicked in. Knowing the heating pack was a single-use luxury, I decided against wasting it on plain boiled krill, choosing instead to store it alongside my canned peaches on the highest supply box where seawater could never reach them. On the 4th day in this world, the Leviathan began moving, waking me up from my sleep. I immediately ate the remaining portion of spiky krill meat for breakfast. Zhang Haitao had not lied to me, as consuming it again provided no additional strength boost. I was slightly disappointed, having hoped to at least raise my strength to 10 points to match that of a normal person. As feeding time approached, I put on my spiked helmet, stood near my stacked supply boxes, and waited to move the seaweed. Suddenly, the child's voice echoed in my head, angrily complaining about annoying creatures stealing its food. Judging by the illustrated guide, I guessed the ocean was full of spiky krill competing with the Leviathan for algae. Today, their numbers must have exploded to affect its feeding. Without warning, the entire stomach cavity violently tilted almost completely upright, sending me crashing against the soft flesh wall. Though unharmed apart from some dizziness, my 10 accumulated supply boxes scattered across the floor, spilling seawater from the oxygenation tank. I frantically lunged to protect the box containing my precious canned yellow peaches and heating pack. Panic gripped me as I wondered if our host creature was under attack by some massive deep-sea predator. Suddenly, a thunderous explosion pierced the hull of the Leviathan, shaking my internal organs and leaving my head throbbing with a splitting headache. Before I could process the shock, the child's voice proudly declared that it had used its giant tail to swat away the food thieves. Realizing the creature was simply slapping shrimp rather than fighting for its life, I let out a breath of relief. The room returned to normal, and after recovering my balance, I set the oxygenation tank upright and neatly restacked my supply boxes. When the first tide surged in down the esophagus, I quickly used the system blueprint to repair the damaged stone trough. As the seawater receded, I donned my shrimp shell gauntlets and carefully probed the algae piles. My hand struck a hard surface, but the creature did not move. Shining my headlight beam down, I found a dead spiky krill with a shattered shell and broken head spike, killed by the shockwave of the Leviathan's tail strike. Excited by the realization that many more dead krill were mixed in with the algae, I gathered 15 krill from the first feeding round alone. To prevent the next wave of seawater from washing my haul into the digestive pool, I decided to build a second algae oxygenation tank using my stored materials. Placing the 2 stone tanks in a V shape against the stomach wall created a protected corner to store the krill safely above the tide. As the second wave of seawater rushed in, I completed the second tank, successfully sheltering my catch. However, as I glanced toward the incoming water, my heart suddenly seized in terror. Shining my headlight toward the dark water, my pulse raced as I spotted a massive shadow 3 to 4 meters long, surging into the stomach cavity. Fortunately, I was standing inside the triangular space formed by my 2 algae oxygenation tanks, so I did not have to worry about an underwater attack from behind. I stared intently at the water in front of me, sweeping my headlamp beam back and forth across the surging surface. Gripping a sharp bone spike tightly in my hand, I waited quietly for the tide to recede. Misfortune never comes singly. At this tense moment, the headlamp battery ran low, and the already dim light flickered before fading fast. Daring not free my hands to crank the charger, I squinted into the gloom by the flickering light, feeling that the receding tide was taking far too long. Finally, the lamp died completely, plunging the stomach cavity into pitch darkness. Just a second before the light failed, my heart dropped as I caught sight of a fleshy, strip-shaped creature in the water ahead, resembling a cross between a snake and a tentacle. Water burst open violently in front of me as the unseen creature leaped from the surface. In the total darkness, fear filled my entire body. I strained my eyes, but I could see nothing, and the fear of the unknown magnified infinitely. Suddenly, an impact struck my head as sharp claws gripped my spiked helmet. Barbed appendages squeezed the carapace with immense force, making a sharp scraping sound. My whole body went numb with terror, and my right hand trembled uncontrollably as I tried desperately to force myself to calm down. I felt something sticky and slippery wrap around my neck, making my scalp tingle. The tentacles tightened, constricting my throat until breathing became difficult and my face flushed. The familiar, suffocating sensation triggered a wave of intense rage, shattering my fear. Adrenaline surged through me, restoring movement to my numb body. With a violent swing, I plunged the bone spike into the tentacle around my neck, reckless of whether I grazed my own skin. The monster emitted a sharp, eerie screech from directly above my head. Ignoring the horrific sound, I frantically sliced through the rubbery flesh. The tentacle severed, thrashing wildly in my grip while splashing foul-smelling liquid all over my body. After a few frantic moments, the creature went completely still, though its claws remained locked onto my helmet in a dead grip. As the adrenaline faded, fear returned, and I stood frozen in the dark until the tide fully receded. Mustering my courage, I removed the headlamp and hand-cranked it until a dim yellow beam illuminated the space. Blood dripped over the algae oxygenation tank from a severed, bowl-thick body about 3 meters long. Remembering the screech above my head, I unclasped my helmet and inspected it. 4 anchor-shaped chelicerae with small barbs gripped the carapace tightly. In the center lay a circular mouthpart lined with scimitar-shaped teeth. Cold sweat broke out across my back as I realized the 3 spikes on top of my helmet had prevented the mouthpart from reaching my skull. The helmet had saved my life. I opened the system interface to check the biological encyclopedia for information on the creature. The entry identified it as an anchor worm, a 2 to 3 meter long parasite living inside giant organisms, capable of easily biting through a human's skull with its mouthparts. It noted that without a sturdy helmet, an encounter meant certain death, though its chelicerae could be salvaged for tools. Reading this made me shudder at how narrowly I had escaped death through sheer luck. Hearing the esophagus churn with the next wave of seawater, I quickly pried the creature's head off my helmet, put the gear back on, and remained sheltered within the V-shaped stone tanks until the Leviathan finished feeding. Finding no more parasites in the remaining tides, I finally stepped out carefully from the storage area. While moving seaweed and collecting spiky krill, I made sure to hand-crank my headlamp periodically to guarantee a full charge for any unexpected emergencies. I truly had no desire to relive that terrifying encounter with an unknown predator in the pitch black. Within half an hour, all the seaweed was cleared into the digestion pool without any further anchor worm attacks. My total harvest came to 58 spiky krill, 8 of which were completely undamaged and suitable for crafting spiked helmets. The remaining 50 had cracked shells, so I decided to list them on the trading channel with their armor intact rather than peeling them. Breathing smoothly in the stomach space, I realized the dual oxygenation tanks were working flawlessly. I sat down on a supply box to rest, opened my system interface, and privately traded 3 spiky krill to Zhang Haitao. Since his helmet blueprint had literally saved my life, sending him 2 extra krill was my way of thanking him. He was shocked by the generous trade, but I reassured him it was no mistake. When he asked how I was doing, I recounted my harrowing fight with the anchor worm. Horrified by the story and worried about his own safety without protection, he offered to trade for a spiked helmet using future seeds or materials. I told him I would simply give him one for free, as the materials were cheap, and having a reliable ally in this bizarre world was worth far more. After closing the chat, I looked over at the 3-meter body of the anchor worm. I briefly pondered if its meat granted attribute points, but quickly dismissed the thought since the biological encyclopedia made no mention of it being edible, and risking poison was foolish. When the next supply box arrived with seawater, opening it granted me 1 iron ore, 1 copper ore, and 10 units of sand. Finding metal was a pleasant surprise, but I knew I needed to wait another 3 or 4 hours before listing my spiky krill on the market, so other survivors would have time to receive their daily supply crates. I reasoned that because I consistently helped my Leviathan digest food faster, it traveled 3 to 4 times farther each day than those of other survivors. Since I had encountered spiky krill on my second day, others should just be stumbling upon them today. Checking the world chat confirmed my theory, as players were actively arguing about seeing 20-centimeter shrimp with sharp head spikes that tore through their clothes. Knowing the market would soon be flooded with krill as others learned to hunt them, a sense of urgency took over. Once 4 hours passed and everyone received their daily crates, I listed my 50 spiky krill in 5 distinct trade categories on the market. I offered 10 krill for blueprints at 1-to-1, 10 for canned food or bread, 10 for medical items, 10 for metal ores at 10 units each, and 10 for basic materials at 50 units each. I then posted a message on the World Channel announcing that spiky krill meat was available and granted a permanent strength point. The chat immediately exploded into chaos, with some mocking the idea of stats while others recognized the character panel and rushed to check the market. However, a skeptical message suddenly popped up asking for proof and questioning why anyone would sell attribute-boosting food rather than eating it all themselves, instantly dampening the eager atmosphere on the channel. Looking at the user's skepticism on the World Channel, I did not feel any anger and in fact, a knowing smile crossed my face. Immediately after posting those 2 doubtful messages, the exact same person had rushed to the market and used 200 basic materials to trade for 4 pieces of my spiky krill meat. It was a clever tactic, as he intentionally sowed doubt to buy time, so he could swoop in and scoop up as many krill as possible without heavy competition. He was likely pooling resources with others or planning to act as a reseller. A private message soon popped up from him, signed as Chung Youngming, politely asking if his chat comments had hurt my sales, and inquiring whether the krill meat truly only provided a strength boost on the first consumption. I reassured him that the market was moving smoothly, as all 10 krill listed for basic materials had already sold out, and I truthfully confirmed that the attribute boost was indeed a one-time benefit. I deliberately kept this detail private, knowing that keeping buyers optimistic about endless stat gains was the key to securing rare blueprint trades from those who held multiple items. Within 3 hours, 43 of my 50 listed krill had been purchased, with buyers on the World Channel confirming the stat boost and driving further sales. Only 7 krill listed for blueprints remained, as blueprints were exceedingly rare and most players preferred to keep them for personal use. When the second daily supply crate washed in, I opened it to find 3 bottles of mineral water. While no longer desperate for hydration due to my trading haul, I gladly welcomed the extra supply before inspecting my new acquisitions. Through the trades, I had secured 3 new blueprints, a wooden foundation, an iron dagger, and spiked leg armor, which promised to complement my helmet nicely. Direct learning revealed that the foundation required 20 pieces of wood, the leg armor needed 10 cloth pieces and 8 krill shells, and the iron dagger required an iron ingot, an item I could not craft yet. My trade haul also yielded 10 fruit cans, 10 loaves of bread, 10 water bottles, 9 hemostatic bandages, a box of anti-inflammatory pills, 100 units of metal ore, and 500 basic materials. Eager to test my new construction capabilities, I used my abundant wood supply to build 6 wooden foundations, creating an elevated 6-square-meter platform. To my absolute delight, the structure was supported by sturdy 4-foot stakes that fused seamlessly with the fleshy stomach floor, holding strong against any force I applied. Standing securely above the reach of incoming tides, I moved all my supply boxes onto the wooden platform, finally freeing myself from the constant misery of sitting in cold seawater. Reflecting on my setup, I wondered if my previous inability to build small planting boxes was simply because I lacked a proper foundation. My eyes lit up at the thought, and I immediately attempted to construct one on my new wooden platform. To my absolute delight, the small planting box built successfully, finally opening the door for self-sufficiency. Overflowing with joy, I retrieved watermelon seeds from my storage box, planted them into the soil, and lay down on the dry wooden platform to rest while awaiting the 3rd supply crate of the day. 3 hours later, the 3rd crate arrived with the receding tide. Inside, I found a fragment titled The Leviathan Growth Accelerator Food Compendium, recorded as Part 1 of 10. Recognizing that it detailed food types to speed up the host creature's growth, I carefully stowed the fragment away for future assembly. Seeing that no one had traded blueprints for my remaining 7 spiky krill, I switched the listing to basic materials, and all 7 sold within minutes. In total, 17 krill yielded 850 basic materials. After accounting for my earlier platform and planter construction, my remaining inventory stood at 90 wood, 210 stone, 210 soil, 110 sand, 110 hay, and 50 cloth, making it clear that I needed to prioritize gathering more wood. As night fell and the Leviathan settled to sleep, I decided to celebrate my productive day by opening a tin of canned yellow peaches. The sweet, cloying aroma flooded my senses the moment I pulled the tab, and taking a deep gulp of the syrup brought an incredible wave of comfort. Using my hands, I savored the plump, sweet fruit before drinking every last drop of syrup. Thoroughly satisfied, I set the empty tin aside, lay down on the comfortable wooden platform, and fell into a deep sleep, dreaming of harvesting ripe watermelons. On the 5th morning, the vibrations of the stomach wall woke me up, marking the most restful sleep I had experienced since arriving in this world. My very first action was to check the planter box, but to my disappointment, the watermelon seeds showed 0 signs of germination. Realizing that crops might grow at a normal pace rather than an accelerated rate, I suddenly felt a cold wave of frustration as another realization hit me. The complete lack of sunlight inside the dark stomach cavity was likely stalling growth entirely. Without access to sunlight or the advanced materials required to build artificial fluorescent lighting, my dream of farming collapsed, leaving me utterly dejected as I lay back down in total loss of motivation. Eventually, the Leviathan began its morning feeding cycle. Recalling yesterday's terrifying anchor worm attack, I forced myself out of my slump, strapped on my spiked helmet, and hand-cranked my headlamp to ensure full power. As seawater flooded the stomach cavity, I retreated 2 meters back on the wooden platform to stay safely out of reach of any unseen tentacles. I swept the headlamp beam across the water, and just as I thought the coast was clear, 2 fist-sized glowing spots suddenly appeared beneath the surface, staring directly at me like 2 massive eyes. Cold sweat broke out across my body as I quickly squatted low, pressing my back against the wall to eliminate any attack angles and tightening my spiked helmet. I waited in tense silence for the tide to recede, unwilling to risk fighting an unknown marine predator in deep water. When the water finally drained, I crept cautiously to the edge of the platform and shone my light down. Instead of a horrific giant beast, I discovered that the glowing spots were actually 2 harmless, spherical objects emitting a soft white light across a 1-meter radius, looking remarkably like a pair of glowing light bulbs. I cautiously approached the glowing spheres and gently poked one with the tip of my bone spike. The sphere rolled a few times, its light dimming as pinhole mouthparts and 4 suction tentacles were revealed on its underside. I instinctively took a few steps back to keep my distance, but the creature showed no aggression, instead using its tentacles to right itself and attach directly to the stomach wall. Once anchored, its body began to glow brightly again, prompting me to check the system biological atlas for answers. The entry identified the creature as a heliococcus, measuring 10 centimeters in size, though the 2 before me were only 6 or 7 centimeters long and still juveniles. The database noted they were bioluminescent parasites that fed on blood and were completely non-aggressive, making them ideal for lighting. A sudden realization struck me as I connected their glowing property to my stalled farming project, wondering if they could supply the sunlight needed for the watermelon seeds. Excitedly wrapping my hands in spare cloth, I carefully picked up the heliococcus, causing it to retract its tentacles and light as it searched for a blood source. Carrying the glowing parasites up to the wooden platform, I placed them right next to the small planting box against the stomach wall. Senses attuned to the host tissue, the heliococcus extended its tentacles, anchored itself, and drove its needle-like mouthparts into the wall to feed. As they drank, their bodies lit up brilliantly, bathing the planter in a warm white glow. Hoping my makeshift lighting solution would finally trigger germination, I gathered a 3rd heliococcus found during the morning seaweed clearing, bringing my total to 3 and overlapping their lights for maximum illumination. After finishing the seaweed transfer and processing 5 spiky krill left over from yesterday to trade for 250 basic materials, I spent some time checking the world chat. Just as I had predicted, hundreds of survivors had encountered spiky krill today, leading to a wave of regret and complaints from those who had traded heavy resources with me yesterday under the assumption that krill were uniquely rare. Several angry players demanded refunds, but I calmly refused, explaining that market conditions at the time justified the sales. While those few continued to harass me, I ignored them, knowing the broader community understood the value of my early intelligence. The main topic in the chat quickly shifted to the extreme difficulty of hunting the spiky krill without proper tools due to their hard shells and razor-sharp head spikes. Remembering how easily I had managed with my own improvised gear, I shared my peeling method with the channel, earning widespread gratitude and goodwill from the other survivors. Soon after, another player posted a bold hypothesis suggesting that manually throwing seaweed directly into the digestive tract could bypass slow peristalsis, accelerate digestion, and force the Leviathan to travel faster for more supply crates. The idea instantly sparked a lively debate among the survivors, with many eager to test the theory right away. However, a cautious voice intervened just in time, pointing out a fatal flaw regarding oxygen levels. The poster reminded everyone of the suffocating breathlessness experienced between digestion and movement cycles, arguing that the enclosed stomach space only possessed enough oxygen for static survival. Without a way to boost air supply, attempting manual labor and accelerated movement would lead straight to oxygen deprivation and death, abruptly halting the reckless experimentation across the channel. Reading the comments in the chat raised a deep sense of crisis within me, as my main advantage over other survivors was accelerating the Leviathan's digestion by moving seaweed to gain extra supply boxes. Now that others had deduced this process and identified oxygen scarcity as the main obstacle, it was only a matter of time before someone replicated my strategy and wiped out my lead. As I racked my brains for a solution, the first supply box of the day washed in with the tide, granting me a golden voucher labeled the Steel Armor Leviathan Exterminator Voucher. The system mental prompts explained that the voucher acted like a game instance ticket, allowing me to enter the stomach space of an adult steel armor Leviathan to eliminate its parasites and keep any items found inside. However, I knew using it immediately would be suicidal, as my current strength and basic equipment barely allowed me to survive a single anchor worm, let alone a swarm of parasites inside a massive adult beast. Stowing the voucher away, I returned to the world chat, where survivors were already predicting that obtaining oxygen-generating blueprints would soon solve the suffocation issue and allow manual seaweed transport. Looking over at my algae oxygenation tanks, I realized I could monetize them for rare blueprints before others found alternative air sources. I knew that once players realized extra boxes were at stake, clever individuals would inevitably figure out how to transport seaweed safely during feeding cycles. To capitalize on this while temporarily distracting everyone from inventing alternative methods, I decided to sell initial oxygenation tanks at a low price, forcing players to trade rare blueprints only if they wanted a second unit to completely solve their air supply needs. I posted a message on the World channel casually claiming I had found an algae oxygenation tank blueprint yesterday, which immediately redirected the entire community's attention away from oxygen theories and onto buying units from me. To build urgency and scarcity, I publicly announced I would test the tanks for 2 days before selling, knowing eager buyers would flood my private messages. Over the next few hours, tens of thousands of players reached out, and after I strictly demanded blueprints in exchange, 8 individuals agreed to the trade for the following day once I harvested fresh seaweed. As the second supply box of the day washed in, opening it yielded a single sweet potato seed. Overjoyed by this unexpected addition alongside my upcoming blueprint windfall, I constructed another small planting box on the platform, placed it directly beneath the soft light of the 3 Heliococcus parasites, planted the seed, and watered it with half a bottle of mineral water, praying the biological glow would successfully trigger germination. While eating the bread and drinking the water from my third supply crate, a private message arrived from Chen Xin, the person who had suggested the manual seaweed transport idea on the World chat. She wanted to buy an algae oxygenation tank, and seeing her name instantly ruined my pleasant mood, as her theory had threatened to destroy my unique lead over everyone else. Refusing to let my frustration show, I turned down her offer under the excuse that I had run out of materials and needed my remaining tanks for personal use. Chen Xin did not back down and offered to trade a blueprint, explaining that seaweed was currently unavailable anyway, since the host creature had finished digesting for the day. She argued that being the sole frontrunner in an unknown world carried immense danger, and that having another advanced survivor could help both of us anticipate upcoming threats. Her reasoning hit home, as I remembered how I would have died on my 4th day without the spiked helmet. Accepting her offer, I received the Fishbone Blade Blueprint, a highly effective early-stage weapon made from a 1-meter fish spine, which was far more practical than metal weapons requiring iron ingots. Before going to sleep, I checked the small planter box on the platform and was thrilled to find a bright green watermelon seedling already sprouting. The Heliococcus parasites were successfully substituting for natural sunlight, though I resolved to limit my farm setup to 10 of these blood-sucking parasites to avoid harming the Leviathan's overall health and growth. On the 6th morning, I hurried to the planter box and found that the watermelon seedling had already surged past 10 centimeters in height overnight, while the newly planted sweet potato had sprouted 5 centimeters. My stone supply stood at 210 units, which was more than enough to craft the 8 oxygenation tanks I had promised to trade for blueprints. As the Leviathan began its morning feeding, I crafted and equipped my new spiked leg armor using 8 krill shells and 10 pieces of cloth. Still cautious after the anchor worm attack, I stood guard on the elevated wooden platform, scanning the dark incoming tide with my headlamp. Finding no immediate dangers, I opened the system interface and mass-produced 20 algae oxygenation tanks, using up a fifth of the stomach wall space. 8 were set aside to fulfill today's blueprint trades, while the remaining 12 were reserved for tomorrow's market. Moving forward, I plan to produce 20 tanks daily, balancing my trade profits against the Leviathan's dietary needs to ensure my personal survival remained the top priority. After eating, private messages arrived from the 8 survivors, and I traded 8 pre-crafted algae oxygenation tanks for their promised blueprints. The new additions included a spiked belt, spiked boots, spiked wrist guards, a spiked groin guard, a manure scoop, a wooden shield, a wooden bed, and a compost bin. Seeing 4 new pieces of the spiked armor set made me smile as I immediately loaded them into my system interface. Crafting the full set would require a heavy toll of materials. The spiked belt called for 3 krill shells and 5 cloth, while the boots and wrist guards each required 4 shells and 10 cloth. The groin guard needed 6 shells and 10 cloth. Though my current forearm guards were simply crude krill shells tied with rags, replacing them with properly crafted wrist guards was clearly necessary for real protection. Reviewing the non-combat items, the manure scoop seemed useless without a toilet, and the wooden bed offered no practical advantage over my dry platform. The wooden shield, however, required only 5 pieces of wood and provided immediate, reliable defense. The compost bin needed 10 wood, and knowing how vital fertilizer would be for my crops, I crafted the large, sealed wooden barrel right away. Without manure or withered leaves, I set the fertilizer project aside for the moment and turned my attention back to moving seaweed. The seaweed transport went smoothly without any monster attacks, yielding 8 fresh spiky krill. Combining those with 2 left over from yesterday gave me 10 shells, allowing me to craft the spiked groin guard and spiked boots. The boots felt noticeably heavy, while the skirt-like groin guard offered essential coverage for my lower body. Wearing 4 pieces of the set made me realize a major problem. The full collection of 28 krill shells would weigh over 56 kilograms, and adding a chest piece would push the weight beyond 70 kilograms. Since I weighed only 60 kilograms and possessed a mere 8 points of strength, wearing the full set would immobilize me. I calculated that moving freely in complete armor would require at least 15 to 20 strength points. Realizing that a normal human baseline was 10 points, I recognized that I was currently below average and could potentially raise my strength through physical training rather than relying solely on rare, attribute-boosting sea creatures. Though exercise takes time, it offered a reliable path toward gearing up for the pest control instance, allowing me to maintain my competitive lead over other survivors. To build up my strength, I started doing push-ups while waiting for the supply boxes, setting a target of 100 for the day. My body was surprisingly weak, and after barely grinding out 10 painful repetitions, my elbows creaked under the strain. Recognizing that strength training required patience, I decided to break the workload into sets of 10 with breaks in between. The surging tide soon interrupted my workout, forcing me back onto the platform to wait for the supplies. Suddenly, something darted through the rising seawater at incredible speed, creating sharp ripples under the overhead light. Realizing that dangerous sea creatures could enter during supply drops as well as feeding phases made me extremely vigilant. I bent low and scanned the water, watching powerful aquatic shapes zip past in the beam of my headlamp, creating 5-centimeter waves as they splashed frantically. When the seawater receded, the creatures remained trapped in the dark area beyond my headlamp, their tails slapping loudly against the hard floor. Knowing fish were helpless on dry land, I jumped down and cautiously investigated the noise. Shining my headlamp toward the sound blinded me with a sudden glare, as if I had encountered another light-emitting species. Moving the main light beam slightly away revealed a 1-meter-long, shuttle-shaped fish with skin so impossibly smooth and reflective that it acted like a direct mirror. Not wanting to get hit by the thrashing tail of a powerful fish, I left it alone and retrieved the supply box, which contained 10 pieces of wood, 10 stones, and 10 units of sand. I stored the materials and resumed my push-ups until the fish finally grew exhausted from lack of oxygen an hour later. Picking up the 10-kilogram fish, I admired my own clear reflection in its mirror-like hide before opening the biological atlas. The entry identified it as a mirror-skin barracuda, a fast-swimming creature whose firm flesh made good food and whose reflective skin could craft diving suits. The guide warned that colliding with one at high speed could crush internal organs, leaving me thoroughly relieved that I had built my elevated platform well clear of the water. Learning that the mirror-skin barracuda was edible brought a wave of hope, as I desperately wanted the meat to grant me strength points to help wear my full spiked armor. Before processing the catch, I placed the fish on the wooden platform and offered a quick, dramatic prayer toward the sky, pleading for extra power. Using a sharp spike, I carefully cut open its belly to peel the skin. Though I lacked professional tools, the skin proved surprisingly easy to strip, and within 10 minutes I had a perfect mirror-like hide ready to store away for future diving suits. I turned my attention to the fish meat, which was completely transparent and silver-tinted like crystal. Hesitantly placing a piece into my mouth, I found it tasteless and unpleasantly firm, resembling bland pork skin. Gritting my teeth against the raw texture, I managed to eat a third of the fish before a system notification confirmed a gain of 1 point in constitution and 1 point in speed. Although disappointed that my strength remained unchanged, receiving 2 stat boosts at once was a major win, raising my speed to 12 and my constitution to 10, though my strength sat pitifully at 8. Hoping the remaining fish meat might grant further attribute boosts later in the evening, I stored the rest away and resumed my physical training. With my upgraded physical stats, completing my sets of push-ups felt noticeably smoother, and I successfully reached my daily target of 100 reps. As the tide rose for the second supply box drop, I donned my heavy spiked armor pieces to defend against potential underwater predators. The incoming seawater brought no new creatures, allowing me to disarm back to just my spiked helmet and retrieve the crate, which yielded the second fragment of the Leviathan Growth Accelerator Food Compendium. Realizing how vital this 10-part guide would be for maintaining my competitive edge, I resolved to search the world chat to trade for the remaining fragments. Just as I was about to post on the world chat to collect fragments of the Leviathan Growth Accelerator Food Compendium, Zhang Haitao sent me several private messages thanking me for the 3 spiky krill and the spiked helmet I gave him earlier. He explained that trading those krill had secured him 6 loaves of bread, 6 bottles of mineral water, and basic ingredients, solving his short-term hunger. He then sent over a recipe he had just retrieved from a supply crate, and my eyes lit up the moment I accepted it, as it was a formula for crafting low-grade fertilizer in a compost bin using 5 pieces of hay and 5 portions of Leviathan manure. My excitement faltered briefly as I wondered where to find the creature's waste inside its stomach, but I quickly remembered the manure scoop blueprint I had crafted earlier with 5 pieces of wood. Realizing the 3-meter-long wooden handle and 30-centimeter bucket were designed specifically for this task, I carried the scoop to the digestion tank, plunged it 2 meters deep into the green digestive fluids, and hauled up a heavy, viscous mixture of plant fibers and waste. Though the filled scoop was heavy, I pushed through the strain to dump 3 full loads into the compost bin alongside the hay, sealing the pungent wooden barrel with its lid, while marveling at how many untaught mechanics this world forced us to figure out through trial and error. Unwilling to accept such a crucial farming recipe for free, I sent Zhang Haitao a private message containing an image of an algae oxygenation tank to offer a fair trade. Overwhelmed by the gesture, he expressed immense gratitude for saving his life when he was starving, offering to follow my lead and give me all his future blueprints. While remaining slightly cautious given the unpredictable nature of people in this survival environment, I appreciated his loyalty, traded him the tank, and advised him to rest periodically while moving seaweed tomorrow, so he would not outpace his single tank's oxygen supply. Before I could return to searching for food compendium fragments on the main channel, another private message arrived from a survivor named Chung Yongming, asking to trade for an algae tank ahead of schedule in exchange for a precious blueprint. Framing the offer as a generous favor on his part made me smile, as the immense demand for oxygenation tanks gave them far higher practical value than many niche or useless blueprints like the wooden bed. Looking at my 12 remaining pre-crafted tanks reserved for tomorrow's trades, I maintained my strict market strategy and replied that I had no spare units available for trade today. Chung Yongming asked what materials were missing, and I explained that making the algae oxygenation tank required fresh seaweed, which was currently impossible to harvest since the feeding cycle had ended. When he pressed me to trade one of my active units, boasting about his rare blueprint, I feigned disinterest to test his hand. He refused to reveal the details at first, so I told him to keep it if it was so precious. Knowing his secret blueprint was likely useless, I maintained my stance until he finally shared the information. To my amusement, it was a seaweed planting box, an utterly impractical item given that the host creature naturally ingested tons of seaweed daily. Sensing that I was about to walk away, he dropped his boastful tone, admitted the blueprint was weak, and begged for a trade while offering extra basic materials. Playfully sighing as if doing him a massive favor, I agreed to exchange 1 tank for his seaweed planting box blueprint, which required 20 stones and seawater to build. With the transaction complete, I turned my attention back to collecting food compendium fragments, posting a buy request on the world chat channel. My message sparked curious discussion among survivors, yet after several hours, I managed to acquire only a single fragment from the entire community. Considering there were 100 million survivors, I realized the fragments were exceptionally rare, likely appearing in my own supply crates only because my Leviathan covered much greater distances during its feeding runs. While waiting for the final supply box of the day, I checked on the compost bin but found the lid completely sealed shut. Realizing the container was designed to open automatically once the fermentation process finished, I set my worries aside. Soon after, the third supply crate arrived, containing 3 pieces of iron ore. As the creature settled into its resting phase, I ate another third of the remaining mirror skin barracuda meat, but received no additional stat boosts, confirming that its attribute gains were a one-time benefit like the krill. Unwilling to waste the final third of the meat, I listed it on the World Chat channel to trade specifically for the spiked breastplate blueprint, leveraging its double attribute boost to tempt anyone holding onto rare gear. My post offering the barracuda meat immediately triggered a wave of wild speculation on the main channel, with players accusing me of using a protagonist cheat system. Irritated by the nonsensical claims, I changed the subject and confirmed that using the algae oxygenation tank to transport seaweed during feeding cycles indeed yielded an extra supply box. While some users immediately realized the value of the discovery, paranoid survivors began spinning absurd conspiracy theories about secret alliances meant to starve everyone out. Exhausted by their childish drama, I closed the system interface to sleep, only for a private message to arrive offering the spiked breastplate blueprint in exchange for the fish meat. Thrilled to finally secure the core torso piece for my armor set, I finalized the trade and began reviewing my inventory of 12 newly acquired blueprints. Spotting the fishbone blade blueprint, I quickly realized the silver spine retrieved from the mirror skin barracuda was exactly 1 meter long, meeting the crafting requirements perfectly. I clicked to construct it, watching a surge of blue light forge the bone into a sleek silver blade with a skull tip built for slashing. Sweeping the knife through the air, I indulged in a few dramatic combat poses, relieved that no one was around to witness my embarrassment before checking on my rapidly growing crop vines. On the 7th morning, the World Channel was buzzing with intense speculation regarding the price of my upcoming algae oxygenation tanks. Some users claimed 50 basic materials would be a fair rate, while others correctly argued that the sheer population of 100 million players made supply extremely limited, meaning blueprints would likely be required. Unbothered by the online chatter, I walked over to the compost bin and found that the lid opened effortlessly this time, releasing 10 clumps of dark green, cow dung-shaped fertilizer that automatically granted a 10% growth speed boost for my crops. After packing the fertilizer clumps into a supply box, I took 2 fist-sized dark green balls to my small planting containers, finding that their foul odor had softened after processing. The moment I placed a clump onto the soil, it melted like ice on a flame and seeped directly into the dirt, confirming a smooth fertilization process. I then poured a full bottle of mineral water over each box, knowing that the 4-day-old watermelon vines and 3-day-old sweet potato vines had grown too large for half-bottle waterings. Looking at my 7 remaining bottles, I realized using finite supply box water for expanded farming was unsustainable. Yet my 6-square-meter wooden platform was already crammed to capacity with planting boxes, a compost bin, and stacks of storage crates. Accepting that I lacked the physical space to expand my farm without blocking the host creature's esophagus, I opened the system encyclopedia to check on the Leviathan's development. Over 6 days, its body length had increased by 5 meters to reach 35 meters, while its weight grew to 200 tons, proving its growth speed was astonishing even without full access to growth accelerator food compendiums. As the familiar roar of incoming ocean water signaled the start of the daily feeding phase, I put on my 4 spiked armor pieces and raised my 1-meter fishbone knife to guard against potential aquatic threats, half squatting with my blade held defensively across my torso. Finding no predators in the rising seawater, I checked my inventory to craft more oxygenation tanks, realizing I only had 10 stones remaining from yesterday's supply. I promptly listed 10 portions of spiky krill meat on the trading channel, quickly exchanging them at a rate of 20 stones per portion to acquire 200 stones and manufacture 21 new tanks. Adding these to the 9 unsold units from yesterday, I accumulated 30 complete tanks that took up nearly a third of my platform space, forcing me to sell them before the next tide filled the stomach chamber. Setting aside 10 tanks for private trades, I posted on the World Chat channel that I would be releasing 20 algae oxygenation tanks for sale each day, immediately triggering a storm of outrage over the limited quantity. I calmly explained that crafting the devices consumed vital seaweed needed to nourish the Leviathan, silencing most rational players by pointing out that slowing our host creature's growth threatened everyone's long-term survival. Ignoring the handful of vocal critics, I reassured the community that despite the tight supply, I intended to set a fair and reasonable price for every tank offered. Realizing that increasing daily production was impossible, the survivors hoped the price would remain reasonable. I initially teased them by suggesting a trade for 1 blueprint per machine, which caused the channel to explode with anger, but I quickly clarified that basic materials would be accepted instead. The community eagerly asked for the exact cost, and I announced that to give everyone a fair chance, the first unit for each player would cost only 100 sets of basic materials, causing a rush of excitement across the chat. I clarified that the required materials consisted of 40 pieces of wood, 30 stones, and 30 flexible materials, with spiky krill shells accepted at a value of 10 basic materials each. Since I needed wood and stone for expansion, and krill shells to manufacture spiked breastplates, acquiring these specific resources directly from other players was the most efficient strategy. Once the terms were set, I added 10 extra units to celebrate the first day of sales, bringing the total to 30, and listed them all on the market. Within a single second, all 30 algae oxygenation tanks vanished from the listing, and a bright blue light flashed as heaps of resources appeared before me. The chat immediately split between thrilled buyers boasting about their speed and frustrated players cursing their slow connections. When players asked about purchasing a second unit, I explained that additional units would require blueprints via private messages, which prompted a wave of complaints demanding the same basic material price for repeat purchases. Playing along, I slyly agreed to sell second units for basic materials as well, sending the channel into celebration until I added that repeat buys would count toward the daily limit of 20 tanks. Instantly, the 99% of players who missed the first drop turned on the repeat buyers, fiercely arguing that additional tanks must cost blueprints to keep things fair. Watching the chaotic debate unfold with a satisfied grin, I humbly accepted the community's demand to require blueprints for secondary purchases. After finalizing the sales, I tallied my total earnings to find 1,200 units of wood, 900 stones, 60 spiky krill shells, and 100 units each of sand, soil, and hay. The sheer volume of resources overwhelmed my wooden platform, forcing me to fill my 19 accumulated supply boxes to capacity, with each holding 100 material sets. Since heavy stones were safe from being washed away by the tide, I stacked the remaining timber and rare materials into boxes and piled the rocks neatly in a corner of the chamber. Piling the rocks in a corner served as a temporary measure until today's 3 supply crates arrived to provide better storage. Managing the steady stream of incoming materials from selling 20 oxygenation tanks daily posed a growing problem, as space on my platform was severely limited. Converting surplus resources into compact metal ores at a rate of 10-to-1 seemed like the most logical long-term solution, securing vital future supplies while saving room. Since sorting through the massive trade inventory consumed my time, I postponed moving seaweed until after the second feeding session. Crafting the spiked breastplate required 10 krill shells and 20 cloth, producing a massive torso guard that weighed 40 pounds on its own. Wearing the complete set, helmet, breastplate, groin guard, leg armor, and boots, brought the total weight of my gear to 124 kilograms. The sheer mass made standing an exhausting ordeal, forcing me to lie flat on the platform until the second tide began to rise. When the esophageal diaphragm opened to flood the chamber with seawater, I strained my abdominal muscles to adjust into a half squat, raising my headlamp to scan the dark water. The sight of a flesh-colored, worm-like body churning the surface brought a surge of lingering dread, as I immediately recognized the anchor worm that had nearly ended my life before. Holding my 1-meter fishbone knife horizontally across my chest, I maintained a silent, rigid stance on the platform while waiting for the tide to recede. Without warning, the water surface exploded as 4 vicious chelicerae lunged forward to clamp onto my head. Fortunately, the 3 long protrusions on my spiked helmet once again jammed inside the monster's mouthparts, blocking a fatal bite. Thrusting upward with my fishbone knife, I buried the blade deep into its rubbery skin, sending thick crimson blood spraying into the air. Before I could land a second strike to sever the beast, a second aquatic predator clamped onto my leg and yanked me off balance. The heavy armor caused me to hit the wooden platform with a dull thud before both creatures pulled in unison, dragging my 122-kilogram bulk off the edge and into the dark, meter-deep water. Unable to draw a full breath before submerging, the combined weight of my gear trapped me beneath the surface as my lungs burned for air. Realizing I would drown in seconds, I gripped the upper worm with my left hand and blindly slashed at its thick body with the fishbone blade, fighting frantically to free my head and break the surface. Hacking fiercely at the anchor worm with my fishbone blade, I severed its flesh after 2 solid strikes, forcing it to release its grip on my head. Filled with a desperate urge to survive, I dropped the weapon and thrashed my arms through the dark water until my face finally broke the surface. Gasping greedily for oxygen, I barely managed a few ragged breaths before the second creature clamped onto my thigh and dragged me under again. Swallowing bitter mouthfuls of seawater, I coughed wildly while struggling to stay afloat. Realizing the creature on my leg was another anchor worm that pulled in short, exhausted bursts, I timed my breathing to its rhythmic yanks, holding my breath when dragged down and surfacing for air whenever it paused. The spiked leg armor successfully jammed the creature's mouthparts, preventing its barbs from piercing my skin, but remaining submerged in heavy metal gear drained the last of my energy. As the tide receded, the anchor worm grew too weak to drag me, leaving its chelicerae locked tightly onto my leg armor. Safe from immediate danger, overwhelming physical exhaustion crashed over me, and my muscles collapsed under the sheer weight of the 124-kilogram load. Fearing I would drift into unconsciousness, I yanked off my helmet and delivered a stinging slap to my own face, using the sharp pain to force myself awake. Scanning the platform with my headlamp, I froze in horror upon seeing the severed, wounded anchor worm actively draining blood from the stomach wall. Driven by sudden adrenaline, I grabbed my dropped fishbone blade, dispatched the worm clinging to my thigh in a few rapid slashes, and rushed over to chop the blood-sucking monster into pieces. Prying its head off the tissue revealed a tennis ball-sized bleeding hole, leaving me panicked over how to treat the host creature's internal injury. Recalling how the local bioluminescent organisms adhere to surfaces, I quickly retrieved a solar coccidia and pressed it directly over the wound. Its small tentacles immediately clamped onto the surrounding flesh, sealing the hemorrhage perfectly. Exhausted but relieved, I put my heavy spiked armor back on and resolved that during future feeding tides, I would simply stay safely hidden on the platform until the water receded completely, eliminating the risk of ever being dragged under again.